Currently, as a research fellow of Freie Universität Berlin, she's analyzing the knowledge politics of global gender inequality rankings as instruments in self-colonizing narratives in semi-peripherical. Wow. Okay. So, you want to talk? I'll present you next.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. Since I don't have much time, I'm going to jump into the I'm going to jump right into the middle of it. And before that, let me clarify my position regarding the issue. I was as it was mentioned, I was the program developer of the Hungarian speaking gender studies MA program at Eötvös University. That was the other public university in Hungary that provided gender studies MA program besides the Central European University. So the governmental decree was affected not just CEU, but ELTE as well. And this unique Hungarian speaking program started in September 2017. And after the governmental critiques appeared in February 2017, it was officially de-accredited. All the gender MA programs were de-accredited last year, so 1 year ago. And I am still the program developer or the program coordinator of the program because this is the last cohort of the students that are going to graduate this year. They were able to finish their studies, so the decision made us not start a new application procedure last semester. If you follow the news about what happened to gender studies MA programs in Hungary, you could bump into the following headlines in the international press. I'm going to show you some from CNN, Guardian, The Independent, and finally from the Daily Mail. They all echoed that the program was banned, state control threatens academic freedom, and then that is a kind of switch or a new switching to a next gear in authoritarian or even far-right governance in Hungary. I guess the Daily Mail, yeah, it says that it's a far-right government, and it restricts academic freedom, and they accuse of, the government accuse of gender studies as not being a real science, but an ideology. However, and this is the point of my presentation, the situation is far more complicated, and the reasoning of the government why they would like to de-accredit all the gender studies MA programs in Hungary were more than simple, or just this ideological narrative. Because if one pays close attention to the reasons why the government wanted to shut down the programs, one could find two complementary narratives there. The first that I would call this value-based reasoning that was mostly presented by the smaller party in the coalition, the ruling coalition, the Christian Democrats. They claim that gender studies is not a real science, but a dangerous ideology that is pure Marxism. It promotes the eradication of sexes and supporting fluidity and transgenderism. And the vision they provided instead, the Christian Democrats, was the acknowledgement that men and women are not the same but should be equally treated, so they are equal, and the two sexes mutually complete each other in terms of their natural functions. In order to provide the scientific basis for this functionalist approach on gender relations, the Minister of Human Resources and the State Secretary of Family Affairs announced a new Family Studies and Family Policies MA at the University of Economics, so not at other universities, but the University of Economics. However, at the same time, representatives, yeah, it was the University of Economics, representatives of the more influential and popular governing party in the coalition, Fidesz, provided a more rationalistic, technocratic, calculus reasoning for shutting down the programs. So they said that because of the low number of students, the programs are making loss. They are not productive and effective enough in terms of that the graduates cannot find a job after graduation. And the labor market doesn't need employees with this kind of knowledge, and a reasonable government has to spend public money in a responsible way. So this narrative, the second one, that we can call a kind of economic or more neoliberal narrative, it's very, very familiar for those who are working in the higher education, and not just in the higher education, but in other parts of the societies of the economy, because it relies on effectiveness, productivity, almost boosting the GDPs is almost there. So these two complementary narratives can be found behind the reasons. And surprisingly or not, it was the Breitbart who found out this narrative, not the other international media coverage highlighted this fact. So how can we explain what happened to gender studies in Hungary? In the global anti-gender phenomenon, or in the literatures that are dealing with anti-gender movements or groups or attacks or whatever, Hungary belongs to those few exceptions where the government is the one, so not religious or not that civilian groups are attacking gender studies, but the government itself. There are a few exceptions like Hungary, Russia, and partly Poland. So one group of the explanations claim that anti-gender actions are part of a global backlash against the achievements of feminist and human rights groups, and it is somehow a crisis symptom of a linear development process or a linear modernization process. The other, less mainstream explanation goes beyond this kind of cultural warframe and argue that first there is indeed a kind of cacophony if someone pays attention to the different parallel and sometimes conflicting and contradictory understanding of gender, the term gender, both in the academia and in activism. And as a consequence, the term gender could become a partially empty signifier in a Laclovian sense, being used as a marker for progressivism, symbolizes the failure of catching up development, the failure of progressive political and neoliberal economic processes in the region, and then that process caused everyday risk, stress, precarity for many in the last 30 years. So in this sense, as some argue, gender works as a symbolic glue, unifying, first of all, heterogeneous group of different branches, and as I told you, branches that are in a conflict sometimes with each other, branches of feminists, scholars, activists, NGO workers, LGBT people, and linking gender people to the association chain of progressives, liberals, individualism, pro-migrants, promoters of open society, Western, EU, and we can continue this association chain forever. And all of the parts of this association chain can be accused of the failure and the unfulfilled promise of transition. So my argument is that in the footsteps of this second explanation, I would like to go even beyond and further and show that Hungary's semi-peripheral political economic position is another important factor here. The country, as not just Hungary, but practically almost every country in East Central Europe relies on and is seriously dependent on the foreign capital investments coming from the core countries of the EU and the world economy, like Germany and now in Hungary, Russia, and China, by loans. And a key element of Hungary's competitivity relied on the fact that the country provides cheap and relatively skilled labor force, many of them women. In order to maintain this model, the country needs to keep women continuously and flexibly on the labor market, so when it is needed, they should push to the labor market. When there is a labor surplus, then they should be removed. So both productive and reproductive work of women is a necessity from the point of view of the government and the world economy as well. And fulfilling the need for a continuously cheap labor force and the very basis of economic procedure requires a flexible biopolitical apparatus. And hereby I refer to the book of Jemima Repo, The Biopolitics of Gender, in which she argues that in times of neoliberalism, gender actually can work such a flexible instrument, primarily through different gender equality policies. And she analyzes the EU's gender equality policies, how the EU's gender equality policies rely on both the productive and the reproductive work of women. So this work-life balance narrative is about combining the two, because both function of women are needed. In this sense, by attacking a specific meaning of gender, anti-gender actions driven by governments aim at controlling shapes of gender relations as a biopolitical apparatus. So this step is not just merely authoritarian, but roots deeply in economic interest. And I would like to show you an excellent example of it from 2010. It is a quotation from Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, from 2010, as I told you, that today 1 million jobs and 1 million children are missing. Hence, the most important project for the next year is the introduction of a new, comprehensive, proportionate, family-based taxation system. This is the foundation of an employment and demographic turn. So it is quite clear that not just simply the demographic turn is needed, not just simply raising the fertility level, but they would be the future labor force. So these 1 million children would be the productive 1 billion worker in the future. In the Hungarian case, by narrowing down the concept gender to individual and identity categories seek for recognition, family represented a communal entity, and it was provided as a counter narrative to gender by the government. And in order to understand this success, why family was on the other side, we should recall the last 30 years again. So both in the transition process and later, as a consequence of the economic crisis, societies in the region became perfect examples for risk societies in which, because of the shrinking welfare state, all social risks and responsibilities became individualized. Practically, there is no other help than family if you would like to survive. So in a context like this, the family will become the only available safety net, such as Hungarian network studies already showed how the personal network of Hungarians shrinked in the last 30 years, and this personal network almost exclusively mean family relations. Additionally, if we have to acknowledge that right-wing parties in the region could provide, and they really provided, some recent political or policy answers to the harsh long-term consequences of the transition period, and these policies were somehow really helpful for some groups in general and some specific groups of women. And here I cited some from Poland, like this family, 500 zlotys plus. Also in the Hungarian context, we can name a few. So introducing these, in many cases, I acknowledge quite problematic policies, but they still provided for these political forces legitimacy when they attacked gender, and legitimated those policies, curtailing further the democratic system, checks and balances. So they, after that, they could, or besides that, they could do whatever they wanted to the media and other checks and balances system. And to finish my talk, I would like to tell you some, ideas. And since the MA programs were shut down, I'm not acting like a person who knows the answer to the $1 million question here. But based on our experience, I can say that the interest of the government was to keep the debate in this cultural and value-based frame in which there is no room for questioning the economic and material unjust underpins of the social structure. So in order to stop the loop of this never-ending table tennis game, like you say family, we say gender, you say this, we say this. So we can do it all the time. We can or we can show all topics and all problems from a new angle, problematizing, for example, the material inequality and structural causes behind these specific issues. Or we can bring in new topics that touch really the essential problems of the current system and crises of social production and reproduction, because it is quite clear that the two cannot go in hand. They are in a clash at the same time, as Fraser and many, many others are talking about it. Furthermore, of course, since these problems are structural and they are causing troubles for other social groups, one could think about new possible allies, maybe labor unions or women's departments or wings or whatever. So to sum up, my presentation aimed at providing an even bigger picture of and possible explanation of the backgrounds of governmental anti-gender actions in East Central Europe. It was talking about the Hungarian case, and of course, I don't want to universalize what was in my presentation. Every country is different, but I hope you could find some interesting thoughts on it. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to have Davide Bushman. I actually read Davide's article, came across in academia, like in a university, and I was really surprised that someone actually analyzes anti-gender movement and discourse in Lithuania, in our university, like Vienna University. So she holds bachelor's degree in political science. And
not anymore.
I guess you finished already the master's. And she finished the master's degree in political science at the University of Vienna. Since January 2019, she has been working as a scientific and administrative project assistant in the Horizon 2020 research project, Migrant Children and Communities in a Transforming Europe, at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. That's also finished, no?
Yeah, not anymore.
So you can update us.
So yeah, it does not matter. I mean, I will start my PhD soon.
You're starting PhD?
Yeah, in November. All right, so what I'm going to present now are just some sketchy thoughts or really work in progress ideas that I was presenting also I think 2 years ago at the University of Vilnius. So I'm really looking forward for your feedback and comments because, as I said, this is not really through thought, but just some ideas. So the topic of my talk is how gender and communism are identified, or how the comparison is established in the right-wing discourse in Lithuania. The starting point of my paper was that gender, Tadeusz Pieronek, he's a bishop in Poland. He has claimed that gender ideology is worse than communism and Nazism put together. And this is a very interesting statement, and I was interested in how would not only he, but also other right-wing people or conservative people argue how is this possible. The trend to criticize feminism or feminist critique is not new, but what we see new with the anti-gender discourse is that not only the women's equality policies, but also the term gender itself is criticized, and the discipline of gender studies too. I was asking myself if this is a historic novelty, but I cannot answer you this question. However, I find it important to emphasize that there is a kind of difference between the anti-gender versus anti-feminist mobilizations. And these anti-gender attitudes, together with anti-communist attitudes, are in Lithuania a very successful strategy of mobilizing the radical right. So what I was interested in this paper was to ask how this analogy between gender on the one hand and communism on the other hand is constructed in the public discourse in Lithuania. And secondly, I was interested in why is this comparison, or why is this analogy so successful in mobilizing the radical right? What does it wake up? What does it resonate with the people? So I analyzed a couple of articles that were published between 2014 and 16 in the public media. They were accessible online, and these texts explicitly refer to either gender or gender mainstreaming or gender studies, and either communism, state socialism, or even Bolshevism. I found articles mainly of three actors, namely Forum Vilnius. This is a very local initiative in Vilnius of some radical right-wing intellectuals. If you know, the Professor Radžvilas, who is teaching at the University of Vienna, is one of them. Also, some famous actors like Rolandas Kazlas, for Lithuanian context, he is also part of Forum Vilnius. Secondly, Pro Patria. I think the name tells a lot already what kind of actor this is. It's also an so-called intellectual initiative of very conservative Christian people. And Professor Radžvilas is also taking part in this group. And other, how they call themselves, intellectuals of radical right. And yeah, what I did is the discourse analysis by using software. I hope I'm not filling you with too many quotes, but I would still, I selected a couple of ones that are really representative of what kind of narrative, what kind of rhetorics they are using. And the first common aspect between gender and communism that is claimed to be in the right-wing discourse is that gender and communism are ideologies. And the very prominent or very illustrative quote is on the slide. I will read it out loud for you. One should not be deceived by thinking that the new ghost currently roaming in Europe is just an unguilty worldview or a naive aim to improve the rights of the disadvantaged. Genderism has become an ideology at the moment when it consciously and after a long period of attempts has started to rule over the politics and law. And each ideology is developed in order to destroy the old world up to its base with an aim for, and this must be noted, the supremacy of one particular social group. So the comparison between gender and communism in this quote is a little bit hidden. I found out that the new ghost currently roaming in Europe is a reference to Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, who were writing that a new spectre is haunting in Europe, the spectre of communism. So this is an allusion between gender and communism. What Tomasz is trying to say here is that gender and communism are ideologies because the dictatorship of extreme worldviews, so to say, is ruling over the politics and law, and that this positioning of her as right-wing ideas and is a kind of as an objective and non-ideological. So communism and gender ideology, but the old world and, so to say, the conservative thinking is not. The second element of the comparison between gender and communism says that these both are trying to change the human nature. The Forum Vilnius is writing, the currently implemented anthropologic and social engineering in the Western states, this means the experiment of the creation of a new human being and a new society, is based on this ideology, which collides with common sense and scientific knowledge. It is the continuation of the unsuccessful attempts of a totalitarian regime of the 20th century, Soviet communism and German National Socialism, to create the project of a new human being of the future. So what we see from this quote, and also in other articles, in other parts of the text, we can see that academia and the academic concept of gender that is also applicable, but they rather criticize, of course, the academy as a field of moral decline. So the collision with the common sense and scientific knowledge is here in this quote emphasized. It is imagined, or it is claimed, that gender and communism, as communism, is like creation, an attempt to create a new kind of society that is sexually and morally perverse. The gender is very much compared. From this quote, we see a lot of fear that implementation of gender mainstreaming policies, or at all gender studies, the studying of gender, can change the society and change the assumed human nature, whatever that is. It is claimed also in many of their articles that gender is similar to communism because these both ideologies deny the spirituality of humans. What else is common apart from the mendacity between communism and genderism? A fierce, almost pathologic hatred for religion, even for the name of God, and everything which refers to the matters of spirituality. Fascinatingly identical are genderist arrows of hate turned to the institution of Christianity. The metaphor of genderist arrows of hate, I have found out, is a metaphor of Saint Sebastian, which is a very figure in the Catholic thinking that represents Christians and Christian thinking as victim. In these two pictures, I'm sorry that you cannot see the names, somehow the formatting changed. You can see two paintings by Andrea Montena on the left side and by Marco Bassaiti on the right side, that represent Saint Sebastian, who is hidden by arrows as a poor victim Christian who was forced by Diocletian to abandon his belief in Christianity. So this is the representation of Christianity that Tamas is referring to as an inguilty, weak, defenseless sufferer. From this quote, and other places in the texts, we see that traditional values, Christianity and heterosexual families are perceived to be in danger. And finally, the fourth aspect of this analogy between gender and communism is that they are claimed to be based on violence, on physical violence. And one of the quotes, The radical gender ideology is being shoved to us by force. It is being shoved against the will of the majority of the citizens and electors. Traditional values are being despised, and the defenders of those are criminalized. Basically, a compulsive intervention into personal worldviews and spiritual values is now taking place. Let's remember the historic analogies. Who was doing it? Who had behaved this way? It was done by Bolshevism. So in this, from this quote, even though the EU and the Soviet Union are not explicitly mentioned, we see that also that gender is perceived to be introduced by violence, and this violence is coming from the EU, which is visible in the other parts of the text, of the texts. This analogy is really present in all of the papers, and it's also visible that the enforcement of policies, of gender equality policies and gender studies are perceived as the only imposed truth of the EU, and the criminalization of the defenders of traditional thinking and conservative thought. From this quote, we also see that the intervention into the personal worldviews and the private sphere is perceived to be done by the EU, and this by with violence. So we see that the differentiation between the private and the public is really sustained in the thought. So I'm coming already to the sketchy ideas of why this is a comparison, why this comparison a successful strategy of mobilizing the radical right actors. In the article, I have claimed that gender and communism are a chain of equivalence with the reference to Mouffe and Laclan. This is a strategy to create a common identity by putting something, some empty signifiers that are filled with meaning as a kind of reference point to distance yourself. So gender and communism and this identification of these two are kind of the negative picture of society that the radical right is defining itself against you. But also other scholars have identified that such identification between gender and communism can be perceived as a right-wing appropriation of the anti-colonial narrative, and this is why it's so successful, because the anti-colonial thought that Russia and the Soviet Union was occupying Lithuania, it's really creating a lot of emotional discussions and emotions, and therefore it is so successful. And also it can finally be perceived just as part of a broader radical right-wing discourse, the critique of the EU, critique of gender studies, and at all skepticism towards science, and especially methods and ideas of social sciences. So I would like to discuss with you, or if we have time, it would be interesting what you think. Why is it so successful in Lithuania, and not only in Lithuania, but at all in many of Eastern European countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Davile. And the last, our speaker is Galina Yarmanova. Hello. She teaches feminist and queer theory at sociology department at Kiev, together with Maria Mayerchuk and Olga Platochnik. She co-edited a textbook on gender theory, gender and media. Galina was part of the grassroots group Feminist Offensiva and led collective research projects on queer kinship and religious and far-right organizing in Ukraine. So, it's your turn now. Are you gonna talk like this? Okay.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Really excited to join this amazing panel. Thank you for being here. I do not have a PowerPoint, so you'll have to bear with me just talking. Just a minute. The title of my presentation is Openness for Dialogue and Necessary Compromises, Feminist Right-Wing Turn in Exchange for New Visibilities. Both of you provided so much food for thought. Thank you very much. I think it will be really helpful for my future work, and I'm excited we'll have a discussion after this. So I'll try to be brief. I want to talk about anti-gender organizing in Ukraine, but also in the context of feminist organizing and NGO industrial complex, and how it's affected by the military conflict in Ukraine, and what kind of changes does it bring. So I've been doing some research on religious right organizing since 2011, and it's been around in Ukraine longer than that, and it has been changing in its rhetorics and its methods, but even though it has certain contradictions inside its logic, whether it's pro-EU, anti-EU, pro-Russia, anti-Russia, and so on, it still shares a lot of assumptions about family, gender, sexuality, nation, citizenship, and it is sharing these assumptions with other anti-gender organizing across the region. It's also sharing financial and other connections with other groups. And in Ukraine, it's mostly done by religious right organizing its churches and religious organizations, often posing as NGOs or civil society organizations. The rhetoric is very similar, right? Very familiar one. It's the rhetoric of homosexual propaganda, of protection of children, of this moral panic that there are more than 5 genders or even infinite genders, and they get it right. It's very racist, it's very anti-immigrant, it's anti-Muslim, and it mostly unites religious groups working against abortion and reproductive rights and working directly against LGBT rights. They're very active on local levels, and then since 2013, after the Euromaidan protests and start of the military conflict in the eastern Ukraine, its rhetoric also changed, and it's very in line with nationalist and militarist politics, and it claims to that there is this necessity and urgency to protect the family now in the troubled time of Russian military aggression in the east and after the annexation of Crimea. And it received state support in the form of access to TVs, in the form of very serious tax cuts, in the form of subsidies for religious groups on utilities, and in the form of their access to local budgets, because now there is a political support of family politics, which started around 2015, which is not economic, but rather cultural and ideological, and means that cities and villages have the obligation to have certain events connected with patriotic education and with a promotion of family values. And when they do not have funding, they should cooperate with religious groups that can support them with resources. So it really helps institutionalize these groups. There is public council with religious, big religious institution called the Council of Churches of Ukraine, and there is this public council with this institution almost at every ministry. And they are able to stop certain legislation and to promote certain legislation. So there's sort of all sorts of different connections to the state, even though it's not really the same situation as in the case of Hungary, where it's the government directly sort of promoting this rhetoric. Their rhetoric had become much more nuanced, much more professionalized. Their methods are much more professionalized. The German academic that Gabi mentioned yesterday, that Dori mentioned yesterday, Gabriela Kubi, is the one whose book has been translated into Ukrainian. She has been invited to one of the most prestigious universities in Ukraine that is based in Lviv, under the topic of gender equality. And this is sort of very smart how they work with the fact that there is state politics around gender equality. And in this, there was this instance where school teachers have been invited sort of on mandatory basis by the municipal authorities to participate in the lecture that she was giving, with the support with religious right groups. And it was as a response to the state obligation to have a certain event on the gender equality topic. So it's would be unfair to suggest that they are just silly or illogical or just really just a whole bunch of insane people having silly ideas. It's very calculated and it's very smart how they organize this sort of things and what kind of support they receive. And of course, it's much more difficult for a feminist group or for a queer feminist group to receive access to schools so easily as religious right groups can. My second point is that with all this context, there is a consensus among gender experts, among human rights groups, and among women's rights NGOs about which topics are of bounds and which topics should not be meddled with and sort of should not touched because religious rights groups claim them. So basically anything that has to do with secondary education or children is something that those who work in the sphere of education would be very careful to address. And I want to give just a couple of examples to make more clear what I mean. Because there is this anti-gender rhetoric of the need to protect the vulnerable children from the homosexual propaganda, basically groups that work with state-supported gender expertise of school textbooks, they say that even though they personally, these experts personally and professionally, of course, they believe diversity is important, LGBT rights, minority rights are important, rights of people of color are important, but certain ideas, they say, are too early to introduce. So for instance, when they have influence over the curricula on certain topics that include human rights, they say that their suggestion is to put the sentence, everyone is equal, when talking about rights and families, and not mentioning what they mean by everyone. And they said that this is a first step to say that they mean LGBT and others, but for now we just sort of don't put it there, but just hope that the next step would be to eventually talk about it sometimes when it's more appropriate. And so this is actually sort of, this really directs how they, what kind of recommendations they provide and what kind of curriculum they help develop and so on. Another example is a feminist group that works in Lviv with young people, and it's one of the few or even only group that introduces certain ideas about gender equality in the secondary schools because they have some connection and they have some access, and they refuse to talk about LGBT or diversity or any other issues connected to sexuality or trans issues or gender identity, because they think that they will not receive this access at all, even in the events that they provide for older people, not just teenagers. They sort of censorship themselves because they don't think it will help to popularize feminism, and this is their main agenda. Final example with this regard as course and sort of a website on sexual education that was developed with international funding by the only group that works closely with sexual and reproductive rights and health for teenagers and for secondary schools. It was very heterosexist and sort of very similar to what religious right organizations say when they talk about the family and the marriage and the intimacy. And in many ways, even though it talked about certain issues such as STDs or family planning, but in many ways it reproduced very familiar ideas because the writers of the course believed that this is something that is a good idea, sort of to just start with that, and then maybe we'll move forward. There is this progress of narrative of moving step by step, that there is a majority that you need to protect first, and maybe then you can talk about the minority rights. And it works well with this militarist ideas of the state of emergency that needs to prioritize very certain agendas, very certain groups at the expense of others. And in that sense, a lot of the work done by gender equality activists or women's rights groups is within the militarist and nationalist logics. Another point I want to make is that there is an increasing evidence that there is this NGO industrial complex in Ukraine in regard to feminist and LGBT organizing, and it really sets the agenda, and it has changed immensely in the last 10 years. And the fact that there is a military conflict now has also changed the kind of money that is provided for organizing and the kind of donors and agendas that is there. So how does this translate into politics? I'm gonna skip the LGBT street organizing and just have a few minutes, right? Just talk about feminist organizing. One of the good examples of how this changed is street demonstrations organized by feminists. There used to be an 8th of March demonstration for a number of years. Now it was organized by different groups, but it was always organized by grassroots groups that had feminist, queer, and leftist agenda. And topics were different. Personal is political in 2011, or against clericalization and neo-traditionalism in 2013. It was an anti-militarist march in 2018 and a march for the reproductive justice at the same time. But in general, it was striving for intersectionality, queer and leftist issues. And it changed a lot in 2018 when Ukrainian Women's Fund received a $4 million grant from Canadian Embassy to build feminist and women's rights movement. So it was, for the first time, it was so much funding directed on organizing, on mass organizing, and not just women's empowerment or women's leadership as before. And so it seems that with this funding, there is so much more motivation for the donors, such as Ukrainian Women's Fund, and for NGOs such as Amnesty International and local LGBT groups that receive similar sort of topic-oriented funding, but of course on much smaller scale. There is much incentive for them, it seems, to use the spaces carved out by grassroots organizers within the last 10 years and not to come up with their own sort of new spaces or new ideas. So the march of 8th March, like the 8th of March demonstration, was co-opted by this group. It was organized by the donor and the international NGO and the local NGO in 2018, and now in 2019. It was changed from feminist march, as it's been for a long time, and I'm talking about the march in Kiev, even though there is similar organizing in some other big cities of Ukraine. It was changed into women's march, more sort of referring to the women's organizing in the US. It was very pro-militarist and pro-state, pro-government and pro-nationalist. And there is a lot of sort of, I can give more examples of the way grassroots groups are pushed out, but clearly it's becoming very dangerous to criticize certain ideas and criticize the state and militarization, not only because of the neo-Nazi far-right violence or state violence, but also because of the fact that mainstream LGBT and family NGO organizing is supporting the state agenda and is actually also demanding that the ones who criticize the state should be punished or should be incarcerated and so on. So there is not much support within the mainstream NGO organizing. I think it's really important to recognize the voices of dissent or the critical voices, and they do exist in Ukraine. There is grassroots critique that is produced locally, that is producing theoretical ideas and producing knowledge, and it's not connected, it's not affiliated with academic institutions, and it's not affiliated with NGOs. And I think in that sense, coming back to the conversation we had yesterday, it breaks this false dichotomy of academia versus activism. Continuing the conversation from yesterday, whether there is anything new that has been produced locally in terms of theory, I think there has been some things, and in Ukraine there are these local critiques that produce new terms, such as oskvrnение, which is sort of playing with ideas of queering things, but also it's a it is different from the way Western ideas work or how they could be translated in Ukraine. There is a new term produced by grassroots activists, which is called re-emergence, which I guess could be translated as hetero-fatality or hetero-doom. And it's a pity. There is a lack of this theory in English because it's much more vibrant than heterosexism or heteronormativity. And so that there are these ideas that appear, and there are local critiques of NGOization, of neoliberalism, of LGBT groups that, for instance, demand €200 fee for attending an international lesbian feminist conference organized in Kiev. They criticize militarization of everyday life and poverty. Mainstream LGBT NGO demands to come out, to be visible, and so on. And there is this resource, if you want to start looking into this in Ukraine, that's my final remark, there is this new platform called Zboku Art, and I can put the website up, that is collecting this, that is an online queer archive that can be helpful to anyone who would be interested to see what kind of critiques are out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear all these perspectives on the discourse, on the politics level of, in terms of gender, in Ukraine and in Hungary. I will use my privilege as a panelist, as a moderator, and will ask you a question. It's kind of similar to what Galina was mentioning. And I was thinking this analysis of anti-gender movement is pretty now on the wave in academia, no? At least I feel like that. Where these movements are analyzed, how it works with all these Christian funds and all of that. But from my perspective, the question would be, how do you think, because I think it's very much necessary to translate this analysis to the wider public. That's what I'm thinking. And what kind of methods of translation or what kind of form we should use to actually translate or to for the wider public this whole analysis in some ways, I don't know, maybe creatively, maybe not, but through what kind of channels, and is it possible to do it? So that's my question. And also in addition, I also have, if I don't know, maybe you had some engagements with the people who actually, I don't know, either from like center right or something, where they heard your analysis and kind of wanted to discuss it with you. Maybe you had these kind of, I don't know, interactions with some people. I'm just interested. And yes, now we'll collect questions from the public.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the global aspect of the anti-gender movements in Eastern Europe, because every time we hear those presentations, we see that the similarities are striking, and there must be some kind of exchange, I would assume, between the people who are engaged in those movements. And I've heard a number of theories about where these ideas are coming from. One is that they are coming from the West, conservatist movements, and the other one is that they are actually coming from Russia, and this is one of the hidden players of the gender politics scene right now. So could you comment on that? Thank you.
Thank you for these presentations that sit together, I think, very well. I just want to mention something to Magda. There is actually research on these transnational connections that shows the links between US and Russian religious groups in terms of how they support these so-called grassroots mobilizations against gender equality. So for interested people, I can give several names who does new research. For the presenters, I have two questions, and I think some of you have already provided answers in your presentations, so maybe you skip some of the questions. So one is about nationalism, in the spirit of the title of the panel. I wonder how you see this type of nationalism as a new development, as a global financial crisis development, or rather as a continuation of the post-state socialist nationalism, a new phase of it. So that's one, and related to it, I would like to hear your opinion on the current feminist responses to these developments. Galina already mentioned both co-opted supportive responses and critical responses, but how do you see the existing state of feminist engagement with this?
One more.
So my name's Anna Damczyk. I used to be a member of Razem political party from Poland. Right now, without any group. Anyway, I got one thing is this cooperation of those far-right groups. I think you can Google something that is called Agenda Europe. There's a big report that was produced by a team of people who are close to the European Parliament, and it describes in a lot of detail how those far-right groups from the entire Europe cooperate using funding from Vatican, from Russia, from Mexico, from a lot of places. So this is pretty scary. This is I read it and I thought I was reading Dan Brown, but it's actually it's not. So anyway, this is one thing. And the other thing I would like to ask, why the word fascism hasn't appeared even once in your presentations? Do you think this is something very much different from what we used to have in Europe almost 100 years ago? Or is there any reason why you don't use that term?
Yeah, so maybe let's answer the questions and then another round.
Thank you very much for your questions, and I also have some comments on the others' presentation as well. So you asked how can we translate this knowledge into the wider public and explain at least what is happening. I have some doubts if we still own the concept gender, or it is lost. So also when I teach about gender studies, and I prefer teach about the sociology of gender, and the Hungarian language is quite suitable for this because I can use a word in Hungarian that expresses both the social sex and the biological sex at the same time as a complex concept. And what I started to do is that when I introduce the concept of gender, I use this complex term that covers not just biological or I would say material basis of this social structure based on men and women, I mean these categories and the relationship between them, but also at the same time the political, the economic, the cultural, the psychological, and all these complexities around gender. So I try to grab it as a complex term, not dividing it into pieces, but show the complexity between the different areas. And to the public audience, I think if we find those new or old topics through which they can see what these discourses would like to hide in front of the eyes. And this is my answer to your question about nationalism. It is a cover story. It is a cover story of the economic and material inequalities behind. So because of the transition and because of the neoliberal transition and the neoliberal economic and political policies, welfare state practically collapsed in the region. So nation is a substitute for this kind of safety net, what people really need to feel. And nation is the one who plays this role of safety net, a sense of belonging, a sense of being part of a community at least. So I don't think that this kind of nationalism is a new story. It is just the continuation of the right after transition nationalism that appeared in the region. And why fascism? Why I didn't use fascism? I prefer authoritarian neoliberalism because it highlights both aspects. And of course, this kind of idea that society relies on making difference based on ethnicity, race, divides or provides a division of labor, like what kind of jobs should be done by those people, Roma people, migrant people, whatever. It is part of this economic system as well. So in this sense, it is authoritarian but neoliberal at the same time, and it's a combination of two. And if we call it fascism, I guess we lose this kind of point that what is not this 1930s fascism, but the 2000s authoritarian neoliberalism. I think there is a continuation, or there are similarities, but the difference is, for us, it's more important to fight against it. And my remark on your presentations, I really liked that you brought this victimhood story into the picture, and I was just thinking about the politics of grievance and how the politics of grievance and politics of victimhood is also part of gender movements, feminists and LGBT movements. So again, I find this link in this table tennis game, who is the bigger victim? And I don't think that this cycle helps us, that who is the bigger victim, because it's like, you know, playing a card that I have the bigger grievance or victimhood or whatever you call it. So it was really interesting that you also showed it in your presentation. And you mentioned some possible reactions from feminists, and this is my answer to the current feminist responses as well. That, as I try to show you, maybe new topics or old topics can help somehow fighting these anti-gender attacks, and maybe feminist movement and feminist reactions shouldn't be reactions to certain ideals, but being proactive, finding new topics, setting the narrative frame first, and then they had to react to it. So then it can be a possible. At least we can try.
Okay. I was now thinking, you asked about the translation to the broader public. I'm wondering if we need to translate the analysis or at all our dictionary and everything what we do we? Or do we need somehow to show the visions or somehow show what we strive for? Somehow I was really touched yesterday by the keynote of Magdalena, who said that we are very much in the defensive, that, you know, also with my presentation I showed how, you know, somehow we are criticizing the critique, and if not the alternative version of this would be to just admit that yes, we are actually striving for deconstructing gender or no family or I don't know, various versions, and this really touched me, and I'm wondering, yeah, if we need to translate or rather to somehow adopt a more radical, maybe this is not radical at all, but a completely different strategies. And this also refers a little bit to the question of feminist responses to nationalism. Somehow I have a feeling, this is very personal also, that right now we are in a very deep crisis of visions and alternatives and ideas of what are we striving for. And I think this would be the first or one of the things to do. So is it to define somehow, or at least to draw some, not guidelines, but some ideas.
I'm not sure that I agree with you that we don't probably own the word gender anymore. And in Ukrainian context, the most funded UN projects on gender introduced the slogan different but equal. And this is something that it really resonates well with anti-gender movement and their idea of gender equality. Also, this idea is it's used a lot in gender courses and gender theory and gender research in Ukraine. And in that sense, the critical knowledge is rather marginalized even within gender fields. At the same time, I'm not sure we own the word feminism anymore. And unless you define what kind of feminist you are, I really think there is very little common ground, if any at all. For instance, in Ukraine, feminism is on the rise. There is the UN Women, which brags how much, what kind of generous funding they have, and they have he for she forums where the model man who is feminist or pro-feminist is a reformed neo-Nazi guy who is notoriously known for being an initiator of attacks against LGBT people or feminist LGBT events. But then the story goes he fell in love with a leftist woman and they met ideologically in the middle because love conquers all. And like this is literally the story that he for she and women's rights activists are very eager to discuss as a victory of feminism. Another feminist victory that is celebrated is the inclusion of women into the military in different positions. And so I'm really not sure how much alliances, we all feminists have in this sense. In the sort of new interest to anti-gender movements in academia, but also among donors, there is very little interest towards class or towards critique of neoliberalism, and your presentation is such a refreshing take. I really appreciate this. I'm not sure how much translating in that sense we should be doing. I think, and I'm also not sure how much sort of proactive we should be instead of reactive. There is such an intense pressure to be proactive and not reactive. Like reactive is good, but proactive is better. I think that critique that we offer towards militarization, towards nationalism is so important. It is a reactive critique, but it really is something that can move us sort of forward or give us a different way to relate, or I don't know, a different sense of belonging or of community. And I think we should not undervalue that, even though that there is such a strong pressure from everywhere that, you're criticizing your culture. Like, are you ever happy with anything? Can you do something instead of just criticizing? And I think it's important to acknowledge that critique is really valued. I think we should, in terms of resistance, we can think about small-scale projects, about not necessarily sort of these big ideas to enlighten everyone and to help the average woman to understand. But I think we should really sort of work in smaller contexts and I don't know, in teaching that we do, or in activism, or in organizing that we do, in relations that we have with our families and with our friends and so on. And I think the transnational alliances are so important. I really appreciate that we're here together talking about these issues. This is something that is lacking and missing. And the religious right organizing and anti-gender and conservative organizing and the mainstream feminist and LGBT organizing have so much funding, and we don't, right? And it's just such a different scale, and it's such a different, I mean, it's just very different amount of funding and resources that we have. So I think it's important to, acknowledge that.
So we're already kind of finishing. I don't know. Last question, maybe very urgent. Yeah. I know. We have like 4 minutes already late. So. Yes, and we have like less time for lunch today, so we really need to close this one. Do we? Okay. Okay. So thank you very much. It was very interesting, the discussion. Let's applause.